Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. This particular story is called We Cannot Let It Leave, written by Insurance Heart 827. The young controller was in a hurry. Long strides of her powerful, slender legs carried her quickly through the main corridors that ran along the entire length of the ship. Personnel busily bustled around, occupied with maintenance, transport, or coordination of large exploratory vessels. The controller's captain had been quite successful in conveying the urgency of her transition from the command center to the holding cells, the brig of a ship. The marine of her people had no use for incarceration for several hundreds of years, yet the comfortable, furnished shells were maintained in such a case as this. Crew personnel gracefully made way for her as they hurried forward, not stopping like usual for either casual conversations with her fellow spacers or professional like her daily check-up with the functionality of the ship. She was not good at hiding her concern. Never before had the captain been so forceful in her advice. Never had she seen her so distressed. The people around her noticed, of course, and as soon as they did, they too must have felt the uneasiness that dictated her at the moment. Her people were an empathic species, caring by design. If they had sensed discomfort in each other, they couldn't help but share the sensation. The result was a constant longing for harmony that marked a species as exemplary for a variety of missions. This here, contact. The younger controller had seen many species and civilizations before. For many periods, she and her crew amongst the Enlightenment had followed a relatively simplistic goal: explore the known universe and find civilizations developed enough to join the cause. The Council of Reason had supplied them with ingenious course through the galaxy. Through some unknown scientific means, they had determined a route through all of the systems that had a high probability for developed life. It may take a long while to reach a destination from another, and disappointments were frequent. But when first contact with another race could be established, the young controller every time felt a satisfaction that surpassed even the most dire disappointments. There was beauty in bringing other peoples into the fold, then elevating their standards in almost every way. And apart from that, without fail, every new civilization brought with them new boons to the other members of the Council of Reason. Even when a civilization had to be deemed too immature to be contacted, it still was entirely astonishing to observe other lifeforms construct their paths along the incredible gift that was existence. Others would return in such case and check up on these peoples, and as soon as they had matured enough, they would too join the prosperity of the Council. Sure, there were those who decided against joining the cause, and while this saddened the young controller, never had she and her people parted with those in anger. A consensus was always reached, and most species still partook in the galactic community in trade, travel, and cultural exchange. The last world they had visited had been a twin world, 2 planets on a synchronous orbit around a strong sun within a very broad spectrum of temperature. Winters on both planets were harsh, while summers were mild. The species there had evolved into robust, short, friendly people. Interactions had been pleasant, and they had quickly embraced the idea of joining the cause. They had celebrated with much joy, and the crew among the Enlightenment had learned many ways to enjoy themselves. The people there had named their world Amlar, and themselves the Amlaha. They learned of the Enlightenment's purpose early on, and as soon as the young controller's crew had earned their trust, the Amlaha had informed them of troubling transmissions they had received periodically for a period of time. They had deciphered it as language, or rather, as several languages. The words being foreign, some of the meaning might have been twisted or even changed entirely, but the gist of the transmissions was clear. In half a dozen different languages, excited voices called out, at first for company, then for advice, then for help, and finally, they commanded to stay away. It had wrenched the captain's heart. The controller knew when the last desperate transmission was a testament to the extinction of a whole sentient species. Almost she thought to have heard the tears falling from the unknown being's face as it ominously proclaimed that we are lost. Quickly, preparations had been made to continue their journey towards the forlorn world. Many people had been in distress and could be saved by the hearty intervention of the Council of Reason. Maybe they were not yet too late. The Enlightenment was an exploratory vessel, in stark contrast to the martial battleships that waged war on the eternal enemy of the swarm on the other side of the galaxy. It was never clear what they would find in a new system. The controller had even voiced her concern to the captain that maybe the swarm had rounded the entire galaxy and was now entering from this side, unrealistic as it was. They emerged in a system of a healthy star, dominated by 2 large, 2 smaller gas planets, and 4 solid ones. On the outer fringes of the system, a dwarf planet, barely larger than a moon, circled solemnly and staking boundaries. Scans betrayed 3 of the remaining planets were completely unsuitable for complex life and would probably only support microscopic entities, if any at all. However, the 3rd planet from the Sun resided within a reasonably habitable zone, though its mass should not have been able to support the orbit of the large moon. Its atmosphere was composed of mostly oxygen and nitrogen, and the temperature was, while greatly differing, still within acceptable limits. Most of the world was covered in water, while 6 large land masses were scattered over the surface. Preliminary scans and detailed observations with the vessel's full sensor suite from several points of geosynchronous orbit revealed only primitive life, though the surface of the world was slashed with areas where no life was present at all. Analysis revealed extremely poisonous gases in the planet's atmosphere, especially around these zones. Craters as large as cities still smoldered in a foul glow, apparently for decades now, where enormous weapons had to have been deployed, against whom or what the controller did not dare to imagine. They had feared that they had been too late. Being an exploratory vessel, the Enlightenment had ordinarily carried a science contingent of a young controller's people, and while the captain had firmly advised caution, she had allowed for a small detachment of scientific personnel and Marines to venture down to the surface to examine it more closely. The group had only been there for a month when calls of distress reached Enlightenment from its ground team, and evacuation was immediately arranged. And though the vessel had had to abandon all its gear, the rescue had been successful. It had been merely weeks before now this shuttle had been taken in again by its mothership. It was also the reason why the young controller was pressing on as hard as she did. From the 96 members of the expedition, only 14 had returned, a horrific result that almost caused the controller physical pain. A short inquiry confirmed the suspicions that the data from the remaining transponders had already suggested. Everyone else had perished. It took the survivors a long time to recuperate from the ordeal before they were ready for a proper debriefing, even if the captain could barely await their reports. She conceded that a dismembered and disrupted account due to the remaining panic and grief would do them no good. Their people had exceptional memories, able to remember details for extending periods of time. The pilot, some of the researchers, and a single surviving Marine were now ready to give the narrative of their experience. The pilot's recount was sadly of little help, as he had been preoccupied with the maintenance of his vessel and had only been alarmed when the others almost piled into the ship and urged him to go. The atmospheric shuttle had been in bad shape when it was captured by the stratospheric carrier and brought it back. Its hull had been perforated with what was unmistakably identified as kinetic projectiles. If these had been brought to velocity by a natural phenomena or weapon system had been up for clarification until now. The inside of the ship had been a traumatic sight. Blood and other bodily fluids had to be cleaned out, and while all survivors had made a full physical recovery, their injuries had been severe. The pilot explained that as soon as he lifted his vessel into the air, he had taken fire from within the darkness. Neither the thermal nor the motion sensors of the ship had been able to pick up anything, and he had been too busy with holding the shuttle steady under the constant hail of fire anyway. The scientific personnel had also not the best commentary. Not trained for combat, they had simply followed the instructions of the Marines and made way as fast as their legs carried them to the extraction point. One stated his experience when he had helped a tripped colleague to get back to his feet, as a deafening crack had sounded through the wood and his fallen comrade's neck had split open, shattering his spine. He had to abandon the body there. The young controller finally found herself in front of the Marine, a young male of impressive stature and considerable intellect, according to his file. He had dark skin and awake eyes, but even with the time allotted to him, he still seemed to cope with the incident. The young controller wiped a strand of black hair from her face and looked him straight in the eye. "Marine, your detachment was victim of a horrible attack. I wish their fate had been different. Is there anything I might do to make this easier for you?" He looked at her, and under his intense stare, the controller deemed it appropriate not to drag the ordeal out any further. "I wish to give my complete account and return to my unit. I still have arrangements to make for those who have not come back," he said, sadness thick in his voice. "Very well," the controller answered, assuming a more professional manner. "At the recorded time, a Marine of yours had indicated movement in the dark. As it was night, visibility for you must have been greatly decreased." "That is correct. We had set up an illumination perimeter, and were keeping it at our backs so as to not disturb our night vision." "Sound," she praised before continuing. "At the recorded time, movement was detected all around the perimeter. First sighting of a being was made at the recorded time by you. Are you able to describe it?" He nodded. "It was built very similar to us. It had 2 legs and 2 arms and a head. I am very sure that it wore some kind of clothing. It blended near perfectly with the environment. In all, I could see 2 of them, one with 2 eyes and one with 4, otherwise featureless faces." She anxiously noted everything down that could be of importance. "As the record indicates, you and your comrades have followed procedure in case of contact with a sentient entity. You've attempted communication in a passive way and tried to elicit trust from the being." "It did not respond to the procedure at all," he said. "The one I met before only stared back at me before melding back into the forest. It was shortly after that the attack started." "What do you remember?" He paused for a moment, obviously collecting the courage to recount the clash. "We heard a series of very sharp sounds, extremely loud, too. Had I not worn my helmet, the noise alone might have injured my hearing. In hindsight, we know that these sounds were produced by a discharge of their weapons." "We suspect either electromagnetic accelerators or gas pressure accelerators were used, judging from the damage on the shuttle," she offered. He simply acknowledged before continuing. "Our armor did not hold. A single connecting shot was enough to penetrate and kill. Before we could react, at least a dozen of the Marines had been killed or mortally wounded. When our commander gave their order to retreat, this number had doubled. When we pulled back to our camp and found cover, we could see movement in the woods again. After a short break in the fire, which they must have used to rearrange their positions, we were attacked again." "Can you explain why you've been attacked?" The Marine shook his head. "We've done nothing to provoke such a massacre. It is nonsensical. The barbarism." She could not help but concur. Never had she heard of a civilization with apparently advanced technology to react in such a violent way. Misunderstandings had happened, sure, but the hallmark of any intelligence was communication, not violence. "When we regrouped and fell back further, one of mine saw one of them at the tree line, leaning around a tree. The being had us in its line of fire again, and he reacted, shooting its arm and severing it at the joint." She only nodded. Loss of life was regrettable, even if it was in self-defense. "But it recovered so quickly," he said. She looked at him, shocked. "It did not fall in shock, or at least retreat?" "No, it didn't. If these beings are part of a developed civilization, their species is one of insanity. I am certain. Not only did it recover, but when it found that it could no longer operate its weapon effectively, it even dropped it and charged us with a blade." This the controller was unwilling to believe. She did not see a reason for the Marine to lie, though, either. "It was so quick, had cleared the space in the blink of an eye, and was upon our commander in an instant. I am sure it had singled him out. Before we could react, our commander was dead, killed by a clean slice through the neck, between the armor." He paused again, regaining his strength. His recount was horrific to hear. A race on the planet below, capable of decimating dozens of their elite fighters, without even showing themselves. And not enough. Resilient enough to continue fighting even with crippling injuries. It was too much to stomach. "We shot at it. It was down on its knees, but we had to be sure. But even as it was dying, it must have armed some incendiary explosive on itself. I must have been unconscious for a moment, because when I awoke, everything was on fire, even myself. It stuck to our armor, and my suit told me it burned in a mixture of mainly phosphorus and extremely high temperatures." "If it recovered from being shot, why did it detonate this charge, Jen?" he shook his head. I do not know. Even after its recovery, the other hits should have killed it. It might have worn armor, but even then, it's impossible. Nothing withstands a directed energy stream from our weapons unscathed. Even large animals cannot hold up to it. The look in his eyes betrayed shame. I simply ran back to the shuttle as fast as my legs could carry me. I'm a good runner, but the whole time I could swear to hear them on my heels. When the doors had closed and I looked out the rear ports, my fears were confirmed. I recognized it. It was the one I had spotted at first. It broke through the tree line, shooting with an astonishing rate. What do you mean? She asked him to clarify. Before, we had only heard individual shots in quick succession, yes. But not like this. The muzzle of the weapon was aflame. That is why I could see it so well. It must have fired at least 50 shots within a single breath taken. Astonishing, she said. Even with an extremely efficient power source, such a rate of fire would be difficult to reach with electromagnetic accelerators. The Marine took something from his pocket and put it down on the table between them. This I found in the mud on my armor, he said. It was a small metallic cylinder, closed at the bottom where a room had either been machined in or achieved by molding. It tapered off towards the top, where a round opening was present. The smell of the thing was sharp and pungent. It reeked of burnt chemicals. I'm convinced that they used primitive combustion power weapons. The propellant might have been carried in the shell, the projectiles then pneumatically ejected from the weapon. It is a technology that has not been used in many thousands of years, he explained. I've never heard of it, she conceded. How can such a primitive weapon inflict so much horrific damage, not only to personal armor, but also to the hull of a shuttle? I do not know. The velocity required should be impossible with normal chemical propellants. But whoever these beings are, they are intelligent, powerful, and extremely nimble. To me, they sound simply dangerous, the controller stated. Not just that, her opponent said. To act with such ferocious violence, unprovoked and without any mercy, they must suffer from an insane mind. No other conclusion presents itself to me. The interview was adjourned. The Marine needed time and had other things to do. The shaken young controller reported her findings mechanically to her captain and was relieved of her duty for the rest of the day. Not long after, she found herself back in her quarters, but she found no peace. Restless, she scanned through the data that her crew had compiled. After some idle searching, she found a visual recording from the rear sensor suite of the shuttle. She played it. Everything matched with survivors' reports. Nothing much was to see until panicked scientists and finally the last Marine had entered. The hatch closed, as he had described. From the tree line, a short distance away, a figure broke from the shadows. The resemblance to her own kind was uncanny, frightening even. She paused the recording and studied the frozen picture. It was clearly wearing a helmet, some kind of vest and a fine mesh over its head and shoulders. Worked into it were grasses and leaves, a simple but obviously effective way of camouflage. The Marine had also mentioned that one of the sighted beings had 2 and one had 4 eyes. As she looked closer at the image, she could make out that the 4 lenses on its face where eyes should be found were quite possible artificial in nature. For what end, she could not imagine. She also felt no compulsion to do so at the moment. As she drifted to sleep, the remnants of the last transmission came to her mind. We are lost. Do not come here. We cannot let it leave. End of story. I'd quickly like to thank the T5 peeps: Cold War Boomerwaffen, Severin Cerberus, Bushmaster 177, Henry the Red, Caspar Arnholtz, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Elijah Silvercross, Dragzoon WRE, and Severin Cerberus. Thank you very much.